It took Steve Harvey exactly 3 seconds to recognize the pain behind that man's eyes. And nothing that happened after that moment was in the script. The studio lights were hot. The audience was loud. Family Feud was rolling through another episode like clockwork, families laughing, Steve doing his signature double takes, the scoreboard lighting up with every correct answer. But then, in the middle of round 2, something shifted. Steve asked the next question, turned to the contestant podium, and locked eyes with a man who wasn't smiling. A man whose hands gripped the edge of the podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright. A man wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, but carrying the weight of something far heavier than fabric. Steve's smile faded. The joke he was about to tell died in his throat. And for the first time in 30 years of television, Steve Harvey stopped being a host. He became a witness. What happened next wasn't just television. It was a moment that reminded everyone watching that behind every contestant, behind every smile, behind every game show buzzer, there's a human story too powerful to ignore. The man's name was Michael. He was 47 years old. A veteran. Iraq War 2 tours. He stood at the Family Feud podium with his wife, Sarah, and their 2 teenage kids, Emily and Jake. They had driven 6 hours to be there, excited for a chance to win some money, to have a good time, to forget for a moment the weight they'd been carrying for years. But Michael wasn't just playing a game. He was fighting to hold himself together. 3 weeks before that taping, Michael had received news that his best friend from the service, a brother-in-arms who had saved his life in Fallujah, had taken his own life. The funeral was 2 days before they left for the show. Sarah had asked Michael if he still wanted to go. "We can cancel," she'd said gently. But Michael shook his head. "He would have wanted me to go. He would have wanted me to live." So Michael showed up. He smiled for the cameras during the intro. He high-fived Steve when his family was introduced. He played the game. But inside, he was breaking. Steve didn't know any of this yet. But he felt it. Something in Michael's eyes, in the way he stood, in the silence that seemed to radiate from him even in a room full of noise. Steve had seen that look before. Years ago, in his own mirror, back when he was homeless, sleeping in his car, wondering if he'd ever make it. The look of a man holding on by a thread. The game continued. Steve read the next question. "Name something a soldier misses most when they're deployed." Michael's hand hit the buzzer first. The studio audience erupted in cheers, but Michael didn't react. He just stared at Steve, and for a split second, the room felt smaller, quieter, like everyone else had disappeared. "Family," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. The board flipped. Number 1 answer. The audience roared. But Steve didn't celebrate. He didn't crack a joke. He just stood there, microphone in hand, looking at Michael like he was seeing him for the first time. "You all right, man?" Steve asked softly, stepping closer. Michael nodded, but his jaw was tight. His eyes glistened under the lights. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. Steve could have moved on. He could have kept the show rolling. That's what the producers expected. That's what the script demanded. But Steve Harvey had never been good at following scripts when his heart told him otherwise. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Steve put the microphone down. Not on the podium. Not in his pocket. He just let it drop to his side like it didn't matter anymore. The audience fell silent. The producers in the control room exchanged confused glances. This wasn't in the rundown. "Hold on," Steve said, his voice steady but quiet. "Hold on." He walked over to Michael, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the lights, ignoring everything except the man in front of him. When he reached the podium, he didn't ask a question. He didn't try to lighten the mood. He just looked at Michael and said, "Talk to me." Michael's composure shattered. His shoulders shook. Tears spilled down his face. And in front of 200 people in that studio, in front of millions who would eventually watch at home, Michael spoke. "I lost my brother 3 weeks ago. he said, his voice breaking. Not my blood brother. My brother. The guy who pulled me out of a burning Humvee. The guy who made me promise I'd make it home to my family. He didn't make it home from his own war. He came back, but he never really came back. And 3 weeks ago, he couldn't fight anymore. The studio was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock. The kind that comes from collective heartbreak. Sarah was crying. Emily and Jake stood frozen behind their father, tears streaming down their faces. And Steve Harvey, the man who had made millions laugh, who had built a career on quick wit and perfect timing, stood there with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry," Steve said, and his voice cracked. "I'm so sorry." Michael nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I almost didn't come today. I thought about staying home. But Sarah said he would have wanted me to live. And I'm trying. I'm trying so hard." Steve reached out and pulled Michael into a hug. Not a quick, polite hug. A real one. The kind that says, "I see you. I hear you. You're not alone." The audience stood. Not because they were told to. Because they couldn't sit anymore. Because they needed to honor what they were witnessing. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. When Steve finally pulled back, he looked at the producers in the wings and said, "We're not moving on." The head producer stepped forward, confused. "Steve, we have a schedule." "I don't care about the schedule," Steve said firmly. "This man needs a minute. This family needs a minute. And we're going to give it to them." The producers exchanged looks. This would throw off the entire taping. They'd have to edit around it. It would cost time, money, maybe even the episode. But Steve didn't care. And in that moment, the producers realized something. This wasn't about the show anymore. This was about something bigger. Steve turned back to Michael. "You served your country. You lost someone you love. And you showed up today even when it hurt. That takes more strength than most people will ever know." He paused, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card. "This is my personal number. I don't give this out often. But I want you to have it. You call me if you need to talk. You call me if the weight gets too heavy. You don't carry this alone. You hear me?" Michael took the card with trembling hands. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Steve replied. "You just have to keep going. For your family. For your brother. For you." Then Steve did something no one expected. He turned to the audience and said, "How many of you in here have lost someone? Someone who meant the world to you?" Hands went up all over the room. Dozens of them. "How many of you know a veteran?" More hands. "How many of you have ever felt like you couldn't keep going, but you did anyway?" Nearly every hand in the studio rose. "This is what we don't talk about enough," Steve said, his voice strong now, filled with purpose. "We don't talk about the pain. We don't talk about the grief. We don't talk about the fact that some of the strongest people in this room are the ones who are barely holding on. Michael showed up today even when it hurt. That's courage. That's love. That's what it means to live." The audience erupted in applause. Not the polite, cute applause of a game show. Real applause. The kind that shakes the room. The kind that says, "We see you, we honor you, we stand with you." But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. The opposing family, the Johnsons, who had been standing quietly at their podium, stepped forward. The patriarch, a man named Robert, walked over to Michael and extended his hand. "My son served too," he said. "Afghanistan. He made it home, but he struggles every day. Thank you for your service. And thank you for being here." Michael shook his hand, and then Robert pulled him into a hug. Then Robert's wife came over. Then their kids. Then, one by one, members of the audience started standing and walking toward the stage. The producers tried to intervene, but Steve waved them off. "Let them," he said. "Let them. For 10 minutes, that game show stage became something else. It became a space of healing, of connection, of shared humanity. People hugged Michael. They thanked him. They shared their own stories of loss, of service, of survival. And Steve stood to the side, watching, tears streaming down his face. When the last person had spoken, when the last hug had been given, Steve walked back to the center of the stage. He picked up his microphone, took a deep breath, and said, "We're not going to finish this game today. Because some things are more important than points on a board. Michael, your family doesn't need to win Family Feud. You already won. You showed up. You loved. You survived. That's the real prize." The audience stood again, applauding until their hands hurt. And Michael, standing at that podium with his family around him, finally allowed himself to smile. Not the forced smile of someone pretending to be okay. The real smile of someone who felt seen. The episode never aired the way it was supposed to. The producers edited it into something different, something raw and real. They kept Michael's story. They kept Steve's response. They kept the moment when the entire studio became a family. And when it finally aired months later, it became one of the most watched episodes in Family Feud history. Not because of the game. Because of the humanity. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Letters started arriving at the studio. Thousands of them. Veterans writing to say they'd watched the episode and felt seen for the first time. Families who'd lost loved ones to suicide saying Michael's courage to show up had given them strength. Teachers showing the clip in classrooms to talk about empathy. Therapists using it in group sessions for PTSD. Michael received messages from people he'd never met. A Marine from California who said watching the episode saved his life the night he was planning to end it. A Gold Star mother who thanked him for honoring her son's memory by choosing to live. A high school student who said seeing Steve stop the show taught him that success isn't about never breaking down, it's about showing up even when you're broken. Steve didn't talk about the episode for weeks. When his producer finally asked him about it, Steve said something that would define the rest of his career. "I've been blessed with a platform. I've been blessed with a voice. And if I use that voice to make people laugh but never to make them feel seen, then what's the point?" Michael didn't need a prize that day. He needed to know he mattered. And if stopping a game show is what it takes to remind someone they matter, then I'll stop 1,000 shows. Steve Harvey didn't just host a show that day. He created a space where pain could be acknowledged, where grief could be honored, where a man who felt invisible was seen by an entire room of strangers who became, for one afternoon, his family. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Michael later said that day changed his life. Not because of the attention. Not because of the episode. But because Steve Harvey, a man he'd only seen on TV, looked at him and said, "You matter." That card Steve gave him? Michael keeps it in his wallet. He's never called the number. But knowing it's there, knowing someone cares, has been enough. Steve talks about that day too. In interviews, on his radio show, whenever someone asks him about his most memorable moments in television. "I've hosted a lot of shows," he says. "I've given away a lot of money. But that day reminded me why I do this. Not for the laughs. Not for the ratings. For the moments when you can look someone in the eye and remind them they're not alone." The jacket Steve wore that day, the light gray three-piece suit, hangs in his closet. He hasn't worn it since. Not because it's too painful. Because it's sacred. A reminder that sometimes, the most important thing you can do is stop the show, step off the stage, and simply be human. Family Feud returned to its regular programming. The buzzers sounded. The families competed. Steve made his jokes. But everyone who was there that day, everyone who watched that episode, carries something with them. A reminder that behind every smile, every laugh, every game, there are real people with real pain. And sometimes, all they need is someone to see them. That's the legacy. Not the points. Not the prize. But the moment Steve Harvey reminded the world that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop and say, I see you. And you are not alone.